Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Shamika Michelle. And Will Riley has the night off, so he's not here, but we have a fascinating guest. We are joined by Ben Jealous. He is the former president of NAACP, the newly minted executive director of the Sierra Club, and the author of a great new book, Never Forget Our People Have Always Been Free. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charles. Before I get started, let me point out the obvious. You're all love, and I'm jealous.
We talked about we should have a show, the Love and Jealous show, right?
Yeah, exactly, man. Something we should do. And, I was saying we should record this on Valentine's Day because between love and jealous, it just seems perfect for Valentine's Day.
Right. We're gonna have to make that work. We have a lot to talk about. This is going to be a very interesting interview. I guess we want to start by talking about your new book. Came out a week or two ago, and what made you write the book?
My grandma was dying chronologically. She turned 103 years old, and there were stories I wanted to capture. There were riddles I wanted to figure out. One of them is the title of the book.
Did I lose you?
No, I'm still here. Can you?
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. Yeah. No, I was just saying one of the reasons I wrote the book was to figure out some of my grandmother's riddles. And one of those is the title of the book itself, Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. It just didn't make any sense, Charles. 3 of her grandparents were born into slavery. One of them, her own sister, said was likely a rapist. I remember being like 16, I confronted my grandma. I was like, who was free, the rapist? So I needed to figure out where that came from, and what we figured out shocked.
Oh, I mean, I don't know where, I got so many things I want to talk about. I think one thing I want to start with, I got to say, like I was saying, I got the radio show, I'm interviewing all these people, I read all these books. I don't think I've ever read a book like this before. So, it's fascinating the way, through stories and your own experience, which I'm going to make fun of you later. But but in that you have something for everyone. So there are times where you sound like the storybook typical liberal, and people will say, yes, my brother, help the people, bring the people up. And other times you're like, dude, we got to be honest about this. And you hit them with some nuggets of honesty that I'm like, I don't know if anybody else would write that. So I do want to congratulate you for doing that. And it's an important book. And I know we met on talking about how to fix whatever the problems are. You got to kind of bridge some gaps, and everybody needs to be part of the game. And I guess I want to start there. How do you see writing a book like this, the landscape in the country today? I mean, whether we agree on what the problem is or agree on what the solution to the problem we do agree on, you're talking about everybody's got a stake in this. And what we hear is not that. So to talk about what you think about that.
In our congregations, in our communities, things are much more reasonable than they are on Twitter, or on the 24-hour news. Like, people listen to each other, sometimes person gets moved this way or that way by the other person. And we generally find that we at least agree on the big priorities. Every parent's trying to create a better world for their kids, or at least a situation in which they can be hopeful about their kids' future. I think most parents, for example, want to make sure that like junior's education is a high likelihood will add up to them getting out of the house, finding a job,
right?
Stuff like that. And so that's how I approach this book. I'm somebody who ran for governor as a Democrat, but lives in a community where I'm surrounded by Republicans. And those are the folks that I end up, certainly during COVID, drinking with around the bonfire or walking. You might hear a dog in the background, and I apologize. I thought he was asleep. My horse, like Great Dane / Labrador, just woke up. But so yeah, that was the spirit of the book. And as you may have noticed, the book is written as if we're talking in a bar, and that was my attempt to keep my sanity during the height of COVID. I just lined up my bobbleheads, and I would talk to my bobbleheads like I would talk to you, Charles, if we were at the bar.
Right. Somebody was having some COVID anxiety. But Shamika, what do you think about that? So he opened with it, talking about a bar, a conversation I think was in a bar. So there's a white guy, they're having this conversation, and, striking up a conversation. And the guy's like, there's an exchange about how the country's headed for a civil war, a revolution. He doesn't know which one, but we headed toward that. So what do you think about that? Are we? I mean, like Ben said, on Twitter, if you listen to Twitter, we're already in it. And, there's no turning back. But then you go out in the real world, which I'm not sure about following some people on Twitter. They actually go in the real world. and are they know people live in the real world? It's a totally different landscape. So you are one I do know who actually have your foot in both. So what do you think about that? The belief that we are on this, careless, terrible end that we can't get away from. You're on mute, by the way, so only you can hear you. You're like bending the bobbleheads.
But he was making a whole lot of sense.
Right, it was serious. It was prophetic.
For sure, when I'm looking on Twitter or social media, period, I think that I do get the sense that we are headed for definitely maybe some type of civil war. I often feel like, I would just rather be maybe in a red state or not have to actually be around certain people. But then all of those certain people that I think I wouldn't want to be around are the people that I'm around every day and I enjoy being with. So then I don't know whether or not we're headed for civil war or if people are just asleep and not paying attention. And so I have a frustration in both. I have the frustration when I'm actually on Twitter and I see people I feel like are just high strung and everything's an argument and everything is, oh my God, the world is ending in 2 days. And then I'm frustrated when I'm around, like my regular family and friends that seem to not know anything that's going on. And so I go between both, from on a daily basis.
Right. And that's funny because that's the thing. It's not even like you're mad at them because you disagree with their views. Like, why can you be this? Why are you so right-wing nut job? Or why are you this left-wing person? It's literally that they're like, who is that?
Right.
Talking about something in the news, you're all mad. They're like, what are you talking about?
Right.
I have those conversations too. But Ben, to that I say, politics is important, but I think that might be the one thing that's keeping us somewhat sane. It is the fact. I mean, we lament the fact that people don't know what's going on, but if they acted like the people did on Twitter, we'd be in trouble. So the fact that they're just like, dude, I'm just going to work. I don't know what's this school, this CRT stuff you're arguing about. I don't know what they're talking about. I just go to work. I don't know that. So the fact that they don't know that is sometimes good. It feels weird saying that, but isn't that somewhat good?
But what it does is it grounds us in what's really important. When you get together with your family and your friends who aren't consuming all the news out there, aren't debating all the topics of the day, it reminds you that what most people want is just like a comfortable life, some security about their retirement and the kids' future. And that gives us a shot to actually be a nation because that's what most people want.
Right. And one of the things I know, so I can't really say I learned from it, but one of the wonderful messages from your book that other people need to learn is that, you can't always assume it's two things really. You can't assume that because you don't agree with someone, there's not something to learn, but you also can't assume you don't agree with somebody just by the look. So we can't give away all the nuggets, but we got to sell some books. So you tell some stories, like you're talking about the books. There's obviously Dave Chappelle, which we'll get to, because that lingers on because he's your guy, but hold that back. The Waffle House story.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the guy if you want to set up how you even ended up in the Waffle House, that's a thing in itself, but you're sitting in the Waffle House in Mississippi, I'm assuming somewhere around Jackson, because I think you went to Jackson.
Yeah.
There's this racial angst, in the air at the time, and you're concerned about this one odd-looking white guy, and tell the story about what happened and what happened at the end with this guy.
Yeah, well, just to set the stage, I mean, this if you saw the movie Ghost of Mississippi, this is that time. Byron De La Beckwith, he's on trial. It's a Klansman. He's on trial 30 years after assassinating Medgar Evers. So 30 years too late. The Klan is active in defending him and in saying that, well, they had threatened to kill me or Stacey Abrams or Derek Johnson, who now leads the NAACP. They said that they would kill the lead organizers of the march, the three of us who were organizing. And then we had sent kids out to Earth Day to try to find white liberals in Mississippi on short notice. Like, where else can you just scoop them up by the dozen, right?
Right. Because you needed some white people in the, you were smart enough to say you needed some white people in the movement. Let's go get the hippies. They'll love us.
Exactly. I mean, you know,
still love us, right?
There are some things that are constants wherever you go, and one of them is you'll find a lot of hippies at Earth Day, and it's a pretty good shot if you got to find some racial justice allies on short notice in the Deep South. Hippies are a good place to start. Right. So, you know, that was the day. But then one of our teams had gone up to Starksville, Mississippi, Tibby County, and they got death threats. The crowd started chanting, "Get a rope, get a rope." The hippie party had ended, a frat boy party had started, and things got tense. And so with that as the backdrop, 2 hours after that incident, when they were home from Starksville, we were at Waffle House trying to figure out what to do. It was pushing 2 o'clock in the morning, and there's a white guy staring at us. And we were organizing a movement to save the black colleges in Mississippi. Yeah. Alcorn State, where Steve McNair went, they just wanted to shut down. Valley State, where Walter Payton went, they wanted to turn into a prison. And Jackson State, where I'm sorry.
It was Walter Payton, Steve McNair, and who was the other one?
Yeah, Jerry Rice. Valley State was Jerry Rice's alma mater. They wanted to make that a prison. Jackson State was Walter Payton's alma mater, and the governor said plainly he would make it majority white within 2 years.
Right.
And there's gonna be no spaces for the students at the black colleges, at the historically white colleges, and you know that's what we have in the South, one or the other. And so, all of a sudden, we're at Waffle House, and we realize we're the only black folks in the restaurant. And there were different Waffle Houses around Jackson that had a different nature to them. There was one out in Canton that was. They said that on Thursday nights the Klan would meet there. Never went out there on Thursday night to find out. There was one near Jackson State that was always mixed. There was always black kids and white kids from different colleges. But at that particular moment, we realized we're the only black folks in the restaurant, and there's a white guy staring at us. He's not smiling. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was a state even back then for $100 and no felonies. You could get a concealed carry permit very easily. Carry a gun wherever you wanted, and this guy's shirt was outside his waistband and was hanging low. And the football players who were the organizers in that group were afraid that he was about to shoot us. And he walks over to the table, and he just stares at us, and he says, "You all the boys I've been seeing on television?" And you know, we're not used to being called boy and answering, but we've been getting death threats. And it's 2 o'clock in the morning. There's no other black folks in the restaurant. So we give the only logical response, "Yes, sir." And he says, "Hold on 1 second." And he goes to turn around. And, you know, the to-go bags at Waffle House back in the day were like straight up paper grocery sacks, right? So you can't see any of this man's hands. They're all hidden behind these bags. They're hidden by the girth of his waistline. And he's turning back towards us, and his arm's kind of out like he might be about to grab a pistol. And the football players want to jump him and disarm him. And I'm not convinced that he has a gun. I want to hear what he has to say. They, they disagree. I tell him just to chill and let the man talk. He turns around and he throws his hand out there, and it's just an empty hand. He just wants to shake our hand.
And what did he say, Ben? What did he say?
He said, "I'm so proud of you boys." Called us boys twice. If I'd been born an N-word in this crazy state, man, I'd be mad as heck too. Now he called us boy twice, he called us N-word once, and he couldn't even bring himself to cuss beyond that. Like, he was the most grammatically challenged ally we had ever met. And then he goes on to say, If you boys need anything, third time, I own the used car lot right down Highway 49, right at the county line. You just come find me. You need money, you need a car, you need somebody for that crazy march of yours I'm doing. And you know what was beautiful about it, Charles, was that it was clear that he had taken a moment. Shamika, he had taken a moment just to think about what it must be like to be Black in Mississippi. You know, and Mississippi is a tough place. It's full of poverty. But it's also a place that has probably the most singular history of lynching, of assassinations of Black leaders. Like it is, it is a killing field of sorts historically. In the midst of this great cauldron of culture and of music, and honestly, people down there laugh more than most places in this country. So there's all those contradictions in Mississippi, but we didn't think that there was one at that point. There was one white person in the state that we didn't know, because we knew like 20 bona fide liberals in the state, head of the ACLU, whatever, who was white. It had taken a moment to think about what it must be like for the average Black student at one of these colleges that was about to be shut down and turned into a prison. But he had, and he wanted to help. And the lesson that taught us, Charles, was we just had to stop assuming. We had to extend the friend a handshake to everybody. We had to give everybody a chance to disappoint us, but also that meant getting everybody a chance to be our friend, to be our ally, to stand up with us. And honestly, that's how we saved those schools. We changed our tone, we changed our assumptions. It didn't matter if your newspaper had supported segregation 20 years earlier or whatever. And unfortunately, in Mississippi, there were still papers supporting segregation as late as 1976. That didn't matter. What mattered was, frankly, the reasonable nature of our cause, and that you were willing to give us, 2 minutes to talk about it, and we would just take advantage of that. And it changed my whole life. From then on, I just did what, frankly, General Powell would encourage me to do later when I was having a little bit of a moment fighting with some folks in the Tea Party. And he said to me, Ben, it's too easy. Like it's in a democracy, it's not hard to figure out what you disagree with people on. The most important thing is to find the one thing you can agree on and go get that done. And then in the midst of the fights with the Tea Parties over voting rights or whatever, we found one thing we could agree on, which was shrinking prisons.
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm.
And it made a huge difference. Georgia, Texas, we passed a whole bunch of laws, shrunk those prison systems by getting out the people everybody could agree honestly didn't need to be there. Drug addicts, folks that, frankly needed rehab, not prison, were at the top of the list.
I want to talk more about that, but Shamika, this whole thing, the whole reason he was there, I want to get your thoughts on that. I forget, because you went to an HBCU, the fact that the governor wanted to close one and make 2 prisons, or close two and make 1 a prison?
Close 2 and make 1 of those a prison, make Mississippi Valley State University a prison.
Yeah, well, what are your thoughts on that? And obviously he was able to stop that from happening. And perhaps Ben can tell us why they wanted to do that, but what are your thoughts?
Well, first, thank you. On behalf of us that went to HBCUs as well. But I guess I'm not shocked. And I feel like we're still kind of struggling in HBCUs now. Maybe not to that degree, but I do think we're still struggling and behind where I would like to see us. And I don't really know exactly what the problem is or how to solve it or make things better. I hear people say all the time that alumni don't give back, or, maybe some of the better athletes go somewhere else. And so the schools don't get the funding and the money. But I mean, we've come a long way from that time, I guess, but it just seems like we still have a way to go.
Yeah, and there's also,
I see a lot of other people there.
Because see, I was going to say that. I said it's also a complication where some people who went there years ago, if they're over 40, they have a problem with the makeup. Like they think that, I wish Will were here because he teaches at one. Like some people are even shocked by it; they don't even realize it. But some of them, I hear some of my friends who graduated from FAMU and others, and they're like, they have a problem with the percentage of student body that's not Black and that kind of thing. But things change and they evolve. I mean, if the foundings where the start of the school started for a particular reason, there's a culture and a history there that's not going to go away regardless of who the students are. But also, we're in a time where there's race permeating everything, and Ben writes about that and how that's can play tricks on you in the book. But while it's important, but it's not important, but not necessarily in the way you make it important, and how you do it, what you do with that is important. Well, you can't say, everyone needs to be cognizant about race. We need to teach it in schools. Probably we need to teach it early, and then not think that at some point there's going to be a percentage of white students who are going to want to go, right? Ben looked like he wants to say something about that.
Oh, one of the things I get into in the book is the origin of public HBCUs south of the Mason-Dixon.
Yeah.
The first one south of the Mason-Dixon was Virginia State University. And it was started by a movement that was built by first former Confederates fleeing the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party back then was like today's Republican Party. It was the conservative party of the late 19th century. The parties were kind of switched. The Republicans were the radically progressive party at the time. And but the back in 1876, Reconstruction ended when the Confederates were re-enfranchised, and then the old plantation elite tried to take back over their states. And as they were doing that in Virginia, they sort of overplayed their hand with their own voters. They said, we're going to shut down the free public schools that these crazy radical Republican Reconstruction governments started because we can't afford them and the Civil War debt. They didn't think for a second how they had benefited those free public schools that were started by Black legislators had benefited poor white folks and working class white folks who couldn't afford to send their kids to private schools. And white men fled the Democratic Party in Virginia and North Carolina and a couple other states. And they formed a new party called the Readjusters. And their claim was readjust the terms of the Civil War debt so we can keep our public schools. Well, then the Black legislators, this is a little gap between the end of Reconstruction, the start of Jim Crow. Things don't just change overnight. It takes time. And so in that gap, there were still Black legislators in southern states. My grandmother's grandfather was one of them. He was the leader of the Republicans in Virginia, and he approached the head of the Readjuster Party, who was a former Confederate general named William B. Mahone, and he struck a bargain. He said, we want to keep those schools too. And the Republican Party is frankly losing power rapidly down here. So he led Blacks, with the agreement with General Mahone, he led Blacks into the Readjuster Party. The Readjuster Party became a majority Black party, about 60% Black, 40% white, that was led by a former Confederate general and a freedman. They took over the Virginia government. They saved the free public schools. I mean, the governorship, both legislators, both U.S. senators, all readjusters for the 4-year period or so. They saved the free public schools. They abolished the public whipping post. They abolished the poll tax. They created Virginia State, first public HBCU south of the Mississippi. Sorry, south of the Mason-Dixon, south of the Mason-Dixon. And they radically expanded Virginia Tech to making it essentially the working white person's answer to UVA. And what blew my mind, Charles and Shamika, was like nobody ever taught me there was a period in history when like Johnny Reb and the freedmen got together and took over multiple states. Like that's just not a narrative of American history. But you know what, in some ways it makes sense we were never taught it because the next period that came after it was Jim Crow.
Right.
And there was nothing more threatening to the idea of Jim Crow than the notion that poor whites and Black folks actually found a way to get along and do stuff together right after the Civil War. Like,
Right, but Ben, you couldn't be more right, but we got to go back a bit because another great thing about the book, you also talk about briefly about the beginnings of race, like, but in doing that, you almost could have spent more time, because I think it blows people's mind, and people need to understand that whatever problems we have and we have had and all that kind of stuff, like you just said, if they focus on it enough, that's all you remember. But you talk about what the Black slaves and the Irish immigrants were doing together, even way before, you know, this time you're talking about, before the founding of the official nation. And you talk, and you start with that, tying back to a race conversation you heard in a bar, you know, when you were in
in England.
In England.
No, there were just like
there
the
was
four
some people,
races.
right? Four races, talking about what the four
like
races,
Scots,
right? And what were the four
Irish,
races? The blacks, what were the four races again?
Right. The Anglo-Saxons, the Celts, the Welsh, and the Scots.
And the Scots, right.
And it was like, you know, what is this? And then I realized race is literally an ancient English word for tribe. It starts out as raza in Italian in the 1100s. It means genus or type when applied to things. Mm-hmm. It means tribe or nation when applied to people. Mm-hmm. And it stays that way up into the 1700s, Charles and Shamika. So there are phrases in the language like, we Scots are a mighty race, or we Irish are a mighty race. Right. That's an old usage. That's the original usage of the word. Right. But in the 1700s, there's this crazy pseudo-scientific theory created that there are literally multiple human races. Right. That's why people like me are called mulattoes. Well, you know, mules can't have any kids. I got two. So like, it's just, and by the way, you know, Thomas Jefferson, my distant cousin, and Sally Hemings had a whole lot.
No, but here's the key thing. When you move that to America, the key thing is, before that piece at the early part of the 1700s, where, you know, before they did that, not only were the slaves and the Irish, you know, indentured service doing things together, but not only were slaves coming over and being logged by where we picked them up in Senegal, we picked them up here, so they were delineating them there. But you also make a fascinating point. You say, we constantly talk about what would Martin Luther King think about what's going on today, and you say Martin Luther King wouldn't notice America in 1663.
Yeah.
Right?
No, yeah, and that's just it. It's like, so in the 1600s, there were colonial rebellions. The rebellions were mixed by today's standards. It was European indentured servants, typically Irish, but not all. Right. European indentured servants and enslaved people from Africa rising up together, usually in response to a common provocation that threatened the future of both their children. In the 1600s, slavery was more porous, and indentured servitude was so vague that it could be the equivalent of slavery, or it could be a very different thing. It totally depended on, you know, who held your contract. To give you an example, in Gloucester, Virginia, where that rebellion was in 1663, it was commonly the practice that the Africans who were enslaved would throw the bales into the hull of the ship, and the Irishmen would catch them, because to purchase an African,
you don't want to waste an African.
They were $50, and an Irishman was $5.
Right. Yep.
Now, you know, and so, yep. So you've got to allow your brain to go back to that moment.
Right.
And then the king puts down an edict, and it says, among the things it says is that the status of the parent, like implying the lowest status of either parent, will determine the status of the child. Right. So what that means is that prior to that, the status of the mother determined the status of the child. If an enslaved African man had a child with an indentured European woman, which happened more than once, not surprisingly, the children essentially were born free, because by the time that mother earned her way out of indentured servitude, the kids were still kids, and they just walk out, you know, of servitude with her. Mm-hmm. But this would mean that those kids, by virtue of their darker hue, would be the property of the owner, of the man. But it also meant that if two indentured servants had kids, those kids could be indentured till they were like 25. Right. So that, you know, that's why people rose up. Now, what happened in the 1700s, you have to ask yourself, okay, like for over a millennia, maybe, multiple millennia, but certainly we have records going back at least 1,000 years from 1600 of Europeans enslaving people, and they list the people consistently as people from a place, who, were captured as slaves. And they do that with Africans through the 1600s. And then suddenly our ancestors show up as subhuman cattle, essentially chattel, subhuman chattel, like cattle, like horses, like chickens. They're just gathered somewhere. And you have to ask yourself, like, what was in it for the colonies to embrace a different definition of an old word, to change how they categorize slaves? And the answer, I would suggest, is this. They tried to suppress these rebellions with the military. Didn't quite work. They tried to separate the two groups with laws differentiating the status between indentured servants and slaves. Didn't quite work. They kept rebelling together. And then they tried two things that worked better, both having to do with the culture. So they reach for the cudgel that's culture, and they start to basically push this notion that Black folks are subhuman and you diminish yourself by associating with them. And thus as being treated, as animals and categorized as animals, denied birth certificates. And yet when the groups keep rebelling together, they just simply act like it didn't happen. And an example of that is the Boston Massacre, right? Like the iconic image of the Boston Massacre was an etching by Paul Revere that depicted everybody there as white. But we have another record from a different founding father. John Adams was the defense lawyer for the Redcoats, for the military who massacred those young Americans. And when he's defending the Redcoats, he describes the crowd in an apparent effort to justify the actions of the soldiers that massacred those young Americans. And what did he say? They were Negroes, mulattoes, and jack tars. Jack tar is a term for the poorest white sailor in the Navy, the ones who tar the decks. The other two are descriptions of Black people.
Right.
That's not what we're taught about the Boston Massacre. Right. Even when the abolitionists reinserted Christus Attucks into the old image that originally created by Paul Revere, they just put one Black man in the front dying. But the crowd included multiple white people, multiple Black people. We don't tell that history, and there's consequences for that.
Well, since you mentioned that, Shamika, I want to know what you think the consequences, that's a good segue, a good word to use. The consequences, we're going back and forth, bring it to today now. In the way we talk about the race in the culture today, the lack of that knowledge, and worse, those who do know it, the lack of adding that to the nuance of the conversation, because it may or may not detract from what they're trying to point out. How does that affect both the knowledge level of the populace, but also the way we fix whatever problems that we have?
I think for one, if you aren't telling the complete truth, it allows people to kind of lean the argument in the way they want it to lean. And I think that when you hear something like that, and you hear that there were Blacks, mulattoes, whites, it just kind of lets people know it wasn't as divided as they're trying to even make it right now. And I think that it would be better served if we could just get the truth. That's one of the things that, when people say they don't want Black history taught, in my opinion, all I want is the clear, plain truth, the history taught. And you let it fall where it may and let people decide for themselves what that actually means. I know I used this example before, but tell me the KKK existed, but don't tell me how I'm supposed to think or feel about it. And that's kind of how I feel with most history. Let us know what it is, what's real, and then let people decide for themselves how they feel about it. And I don't think we have that. As long as you hide something, regardless of the side that it's on, you don't get the truth, and people don't get a real opinion of how they feel because it's based on lies or half truths.
But right, kind of. Sometimes it could be as extreme as a lie of omission. Like it's intentional. It's one when if it's not intentional, or based on what it is. I think the issue though is that there's space for, and I kind of get the argument that knowing where you're from. I mean, Ben tells a story about a white guy coming for help, and he just saw himself as white. He said, "Well, I'm white." Well, where are you from? Which he just said, "I'm white." But once he found out more about himself, it opened his eyes and he saw things differently. So I'm not going to negate the fact that that's important. I think that in some ways we're being told that you're only supposed to see the bad, right? So you're supposed to see yourself in this, this mire of history of Jim Crow and racism and slavery, which is true in some cases, right? Based on your personal history, right? But in some of those places, they eliminate, this resilience and this positivity and this, what's the title of the book about? We were always free. They miss some of those spots in highlighting the bad. They miss, where people overcame in different parts along the history. But also, I think the key is the piece, the other part that he just mentioned, how it shouldn't be this Olympics about who had it worse. In America, you know who that is. That's a given. But in order to talk about how we got here, you can't just say slavery. You need to understand how we got here. There needs to be a class component. There needs to be a populism component to it. And let's be honest, it's not all, we think it's all political games, and for some it is, but at the end of the day, it's just not enough time, right? So if you're talking about how you're going to teach that in K through 12 education to first graders in, just in Black History Month, and then, in one or two courses drip throughout the year, you're not going to get to, indentured servitude and the Irish. And like most people, here's another one. Ben's a Rhodes Scholar, so he'll know. But most people talk about, Japanese being interned, right? Right. But most people don't know before that Germans were interned too, right? I mean, it's not like somebody was hiding that to make it a point. It's just that there's not enough time to cover everything, but all that plays a part, right? So when you talk about, we had, one of the few times Nicole Hannah-Jones and I had a disagreement directly is because she was saying something about immigrants. And I understand it was a comment. I'd love to get your opinion, not on her, Ben. We just on this type of tapestry of the history. So she was talking about, this was the Asians pushing back against the affirmative action thing, like we're being discriminated against. And she disagreed with them, which is totally fine. But her argument was, how dare you? You are only able to do what you're doing on the backs of Blacks because of the civil rights movement, right? And I say that, and all I said to her was, that's limiting. You act as if the current generations of Asians here probably true, but you act like Asians came to America because of the opening of the Civil Rights Act, and you're negating that the only races really mentioned specifically in the laws in the 20th century was the Asiatic Exclusion Act of 1917, and in the late 1800s, the Chinese Exclusion Acts, right? So they had to have been here in order for you to say, okay, let's not allow any more of them here.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is you're erasing any of that. The ones who, when the people run off the plantations and some of the people continue to sharecrop, some people stayed where they were, some people took over the areas. All this work, these lands.
Well, my son who was 10 broke it down tonight. So we're reading the book Sapiens, which is like a history of the world, and there's a graphic novel version. Mm-hmm. A 10-year-old guy going through that, and it says that 46,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens came to the Americas.
Right.
46,000 years ago. My son's like, Dad, what I love when they teach us Columbus Day is they teach us that Columbus discovered America, and then the Native Americans ran him out of the place that he discovered.
Right.
Right. Well, how can you discover America if there's already Native Americans there? Like, how did that work, Dad? And I was just like, you have a point, son.
Well, they also shouldn't teach you that America discovered I mean, that Columbus discovered America, right? So my son had that lesson in first grade, and the way it was taught, I'm like, well, that's not really true. Again, this is a great example of what Shamika's talking about. You need to teach the negatives of Columbus, and then you should tell why they celebrate, whether you agree with it or not. So in his case, he had a teacher that didn't agree with it. So her response was just, it shouldn't be a holiday. That's fine. That's fine. That's your opinion. But you need to talk about, okay, what was, the contributions made from whatever. So talk about the bad, and that. Don't just say, and don't say, well, they say he discovered America, but he didn't. But I don't think people were really, I was never taught that he discovered America.
Yeah, I mean, I was taught that, but what I would say is this: what they don't teach you is why we celebrate Columbus Day.
Right.
And we celebrate Columbus Day because one of the largest lynchings in the history of America happened in New Orleans when they targeted Sicilian immigrants, and they lynched more than a dozen of them. And that's what prompted Columbus Day. Mm-hmm. And it's Charles, my mom can remember when she made her first white friend. Segregation was a super unnatural thing, and here in my book, right, I talk about meeting this white woman from the other side of the old plantation, and the thing that blew me away was she always considered us to be family.
Right.
It was the interest, it was, and it wasn't like there wasn't any pain or contradictions there. I mean, literally, there I am at a conference, and the book for people just tuning in is called Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. And there I was at a conference, and I'm talking to this guy next to me, and it comes out that his wife's maiden name is Bland, and she's from Petersburg, Virginia, and my people are Blands from Petersburg, Virginia. Mm-hmm. And I was a little drunk. We had cocktails and we had wine at dinner, but the food hadn't showed up yet. And so I just look at him and I say, "Sir, I don't know how to say this, but I'm pretty sure your wife's family used to own my mama's family."
That's a great conversation starter.
I mean, I was a journalist at the time. Like, we just kind of, learned to say provocative things just to see what's going to happen next. And he switched seats with her, and he tells her what I said, and I'm like, "Oh no!" And so then she gets up in my face the way that like any 80-year-old feels comfortable, just gets right up in my face, just looking at me and not smiling. He goes, "Give me a kiss. I always knew I had Black family." And I was just like, and then she says, I said to her, after it kind of caught my breath, I said, "How did you know he had Black?" She says, "Well, when my mama and her sisters were squabbling on the party line, Mammy could get on the," first off, she said Mammy. She didn't say my Mammy. I always imagined, I never heard anybody, I never thought they had a Mammy before. I always assumed it would be like a rich kid says my nanny, Right. But no. She said Mammy like you would say mommy. She said, when my mama and her sisters started squabbling on the party line, Mammy would get on that phone call and squash any argument in 15 seconds flat. In the Bland family, only blood can do that. And I was just like I never heard the voice of anybody from inside the family that owned us. Mm-hmm. I never heard anybody refer to a man. And yet my heart was opening to this woman. She would become a great friend. She would always treat me like family. And she wasn't very impressed when we got the DNA to prove it. She was intrigued that we have proof that we both descended from Thomas Jefferson's grandma. Like, that was interesting to her. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, she was just like, yeah, like I've been calling you Cousin Ben for 5 years now. There's a reason. Like, you look like us. Mm-hmm. Right. And then I find, to Shamika's question, I find the will of the last Bland to own my Blands. And in there is my grandmother's great-grandfather, the only enslaved person mentioned in the will. He's not being freed. The owner didn't have the courage or the compassion, I don't know. But, there's something good he didn't have because he didn't free him. But he spent a paragraph protecting him and trying to control the ways he might, his life might be impacted by being somebody else's manservant.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I say to Henry Louis Gates Jr., like, what's going on here? I said, well, Ben, based on the DNA, based on some other documents, and based on this paragraph in this will, I'd say what's happening is the owner realizes that his
brother or
enslaved,
somebody, right?
yeah, his enslaved manservant is his older brother by 6 years, and he's trying to protect him. And why is that important? It's important because what we have to finally admit is our country at its core is like a hyper dysfunctional family.
Yep.
But we're family, and that's not nothing.
Right.
You know, it's like I was backstage. I kind of reference this in passing the book. I won't get into it, but I was backstage in 2008, the NAACP convention, when John McCain came through. And Myrlie Evers pulled him aside. And she said, John, you know, my people come off the McCain plantation in West Point. And John just got quiet because the thing was for Arizona. The McCains are from West Point, Mississippi. And she goes, that's right, John. You and I are cousins. Well, nobody wants to disown Myrlie Evers. She's about as regal as they get. You know, she's a heroine of the civil rights movement. She's the closest thing we have to Coretta Scott King still living. But John was, you know, he was bleary-eyed. He'd been running for president. You could tell, like, the man's emotional elasticity was pulled tight. And he was just like, you could tell he had no idea what to say, you know? But I would like to think that he enjoyed knowing that Myrlie Evers was his cousin.
Right.
You know, Strom Thurmond's maternal uncle's name is Al Sharpton.
That's
from
great.
the same corner of South Carolina, and all Al Sharptons from that corner of South Carolina descend from the same Al Sharpton.
Wow.
And by the way, if you think about the two men, set aside their politics, their style of communication is actually fairly similar. They're kind of bombastic leaders, you know what I'm saying? You know,
so,
and seasoned statesmen.
Well, I gotta ask you this though. So why doesn't anybody else talk like you? Why don't we hear any of that in the discourse?
You know, I mean, I was born on a bridge, man. Like it was a weird life, you know. I was born on a bridge between black and white. My parents were married in '66 and it was still illegal. Right. You know, they had to get married in DC. They had to do things that people should never be subjected to. From the old, you know, they moved out to California, but I was still shipped back to West Baltimore every summer to confirm like my cultural education, being around the country. I tell my white friends, I say, look, y'all got lots of summer camps. Black folks, we have one. It has many locations, same name, grandma's house.
Right.
And you know, and so I think part of it, honestly, you know, it's funny. Like somebody said to me, like, man, you were like the angriest student in college. Like you were so angry, like what was going on? And I was like, well, I mean, let's think about it. On the one hand, I was being treated like every other black student. It kind of sucked. On the other, campus security would call us in like we were like, you know, kind of young men they were afraid of from Harlem. And they would call us in every day. We're like, well, geez,
we're the same people as yesterday.
Every day. Right. We must go to school here. So how about you stop reporting us every time we walk through the gate like we're visiting,
right?
You know, from somewhere else. So like there was that. But on the other hand, like my dad's a white guy who descends from a man who gave 200 acres to start Harvard University. So my father's like sense of entitlement in this country, the sense of like ownership is profound. He descends from 7 Revolutionary War soldiers, including the youngest combatant of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And those folks from New England, man, they talk about the American Revolution like it was last week. and they have a perfect.
Those are your people.
You know, and my grandmother helped maintain institutions like the Daughters of the American Revolution. And they really feel like, you know, they own stock in America in a profound way. And, you know, but the other interesting thing is, honestly, so did my black grandmother. And that's one of the things that I kind of unraveled in the book. Part of it absolutely was her fierce pride and all the sacrifice made family. And we knew like what family member had like invented air conditioning on his railroad by getting a block of ice and putting a fan behind it. You know, like there's all those little things. But the thing that we didn't talk about that I figured out in the book was that her grandfather would go on to be the leader of the Black Republicans in Virginia just 17 years after the end of slavery in Virginia, or 16 years. Was 17 when he walked out of slavery, and he knew that he was Robert E. Lee's cousin because he knew that his owner was his uncle, and his uncle was an outspoken cousin.
Okay, stop, man. Because Shamika's looking like, well, who is he not related to? No, seriously, he is related to everyone. Dick Cheney, Robert, the best of Skip Lee. I mean, what is it? Skip Gates saying that, man, we do this DNA thing all the time. You see him on TV, bringing celebrities. He's like, you are the whitest black man we've ever done.
Yeah, and I was just like, Negro, I'm 20% African. In Virginia, to be black, you had to be 3.
Look, I'm just saying, wait, when you wrote that part about 3, I was like,
yeah. I also knew what Skip's last girlfriend looked like, so I was like, okay, whatever, man. But I know you've met black folks like me before, but but I didn't get that, but that's what I was thinking. No, it's but you got to say to yourself, okay, what would it mean if you were 17 years old and you're walking out of slavery at the end of the Battle of Appomattox, and Robert E. Lee was your cousin? At the minimum, it would mean that you knew that you were of the same stuff as of the other men who had been leading the state. So why shouldn't you throw your hat in the ring at the right time when you felt prepared enough and try your hand at leading the state too? And again, the narrative of movies like Birth of a Nation, which made the Black Reconstruction statesmen look like buffoons and rapists and animals, that was one narrative. But the Black Reconstruction or the Black post-Reconstruction statesmen about them, narrative about themselves, as far as I can tell, is we're qualified to lead, so we're going to lead. Right. And part of that in a little, southern city is knowing who else around town you're related to. And in his case, everybody who was leading that town and a lot of people were leading that state were his relatives, and it.
So I guess, Shamika, you're going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, well, I'm Peyton and Eli Manning's cousin, so at least I have some football greats.
Well, you need to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I see. Like, we should know these things. And the thing is that we're getting far enough away from slavery that honestly, both sides of the family can kind of laugh about it, feel a little fascinated about it, deal with it or not, But it's, in my experience, it just enriches your life. I encourage people to get their DNA done and then run it through multiple databases to get as much information as you can. I give you my own experience. I was told by African ancestry that my grandfather, which is some Howard University professors, and they've mapped out Africa in a way that few people have, that my grandfather descends from the Lemba people of Sierra Leone. That was interesting to me. I got some folks to go visit and to study and to learn about. It connects us not just to Africa, which is a big place, but to a very small place in Africa. And that's interesting. With my grandmother, though, the best I can say is, well, her X chromosome's Asian. That usually means that you're Native American. Skip Gates thought he had 6 months he could figure out what tribe. He took 2 years to find out that she also comes from a woman from Africa, but somebody who descends from the Polynesian founders of Madagascar.
Pirates, right? Pirates.
Yes. People show up as pirates. They're still pirates, which was, I was so glad that we could get that specific, because I had to explain to my daughter that we were not related to Pocahontas, which was always like grandma's legend.
Right.
And the only thing that was better than Pocahontas in this 8-year-old black girl's eyes was pirates. She was like, oh, that's way cooler.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. This thing is a lot more complicated, incestual. You can't just say, this is them and this is us, especially this many years removed. And if we're going to fix the current problems, we have to learn from the past. So it's not like we can't look back, but we have to look back with a very careful set of eyes. Learn from it. Not put down people today, if you find out some white guy's your ancestor, that's still your DNA, right? If they had some medical genetics, that would be your genetics. So you can say, well, that's not my family. And we have to do it in a way that's productive, right? We can't cut people out of the conversation. And I think that's what a lot of people, unlike you, are doing. So what any last words you want to say about how we should move this forward? Because you talk a lot about, again, it's a unifying message you give. So how do we do that?
Yeah, it's a few things. One, I think we just need to accept, Derek Bell a long time ago said racism was permanent. We need to accept that there's no reason that needs to be true. I mean, honestly, who wants to raise Black children and tell them, oh, it's never going to get any better?
Right.
It doesn't make sense. Two, we need to really encourage people to understand that race, as we understand it, racism it's something that this country created, that was created in the context of the New World and colonialism. Right. We can undo anything that we've done. So be hopeful. But as far as kind of practical steps, I say to folks, get to know like where you're from. Be curious about your DNA. Dig into that. Go on a journey. It's not going to make you less Black, but it will make you more clear about who you're actually connected to and what that tells you about you and your culture. Two, really make it a practice to make new friends, and not just people who look like you or who live next to you. And when you do, and work is often a place where it's easy to do this. Try to find one thing that you can agree on. My life has been so enriched by people who, at first, I just found one thing that we agree on, and then eventually you find out that there are, many, many more things. Mm-hmm. And finally, I would say, stay curious about American history, because there's a lot that we haven't been taught. And honestly, there's that old thing they say, if you don't know your history, you're bound to repeat it. Mm-hmm. Some of the stuff that we're not taught is actually the stuff that's the most gives us the greatest reason to be hopeful. The fact that there's a point in history when former Confederate soldiers, the men who did not own slaves and yet fought on the side defending slavery, and freedmen got together less than 20 years after the war was over to try to save the schools for their local kids, blew my mind. The last thing I'd say is, when you teach American history, do your best to be as comprehensive as possible. And this is what I mean. When the Jim Crow Constitution was created in Virginia in 1902, and they actually wrote the poll tax into the state constitution, we're told that was an attack on Black voting rights. And it was. 80% of Black people were disenfranchised by the law. What we're not taught is that 50% of whites were disenfranchised by that law. And what we're also not taught is that those whites, the poorer whites, the whites that did not own land, mm-hmm. and back then it was just men, that they had only had the right to vote 20 years longer than Black men.
Right.
That they gotten the right to vote in the 1840s, Black men in the 1860s. Yep. And by the 1880s, they were teaming up and trying to change the state to better all of their families. And then less than 20 years after that, they take away the right to vote from both groups. And that's important to understand too.
We got to do this again. We didn't even discuss. We got to get it. We didn't get to criminal justice. I still don't know where we disagree. This is our like second conversation. I mean, it was like, I don't know. We have to disagree somewhere, but I don't know. That's the goal, is to find out where I disagree with Ben Jealous. I hope I get the opportunity.
Let me just say, brother, I love talking to you, Charles Love.
Well, and I'm a bit jealous of I did get a chance to make fun of you, all the name dropping you did in the book. Oh my God. The day that he did it, but I love the whole, so the other day I was talking to Desmond Tutu, and then
Tutu, the wonderful thing about Tutu is that he laughed all the time. You could be talking about literally a South African child facing the death penalty in Mississippi. He'd be laser focused on that while laughing and cooing at his grandchild, all at the same time. And you're like, you know what? This is how you survive apartheid.
Right.
Like, if you just, you don't let them get you so down that you stop laughing. You laugh all the time, even while you're plotting on, how to win freedom for somebody that they're trying to kill.
Yeah, well, we need to do that. And then next time, I guess you can tell us all kind of stories about your god brother, Dave Chappelle. He is Ben Jealous, former president of NAACP, new executive director of the Sierra Club, and author of Never Forget Our People Were Always Free. Ben, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shamika. Thank you, Charles.
I don't often do this, but I wanted to add an addendum to this interview. I mentioned in the course of the interview that I read a lot of books, and I'd never read a book quite like this one. And I guess here I want to talk about just one of the many reasons why. You read this book and you are destined to find a lot of things you agree with, regardless of where you land on the political spectrum, and some things you don't necessarily like. But in our conversation, I talked a lot about how he tried to push for a unifying message and getting everybody to talk. And I pointed out how that's rare these days. But I wanted to point out a really poignant example of that in the book. In the chapter, An American Parable, Ben talks about going to see a guy speak. Bob Zellner is his name. And he has an interesting take on racism in America. His father was a member of the Klan, and he wanted to talk about how the racism of the South affected his family and him personally. He told a dramatic story about what he witnessed, how it affected them, and later wrote a letter to Ben's mother. The book is worth reading, but you should buy it, if for nothing else, just to read Bob's letter alone. After printing that letter, Ben talks about how everyone's affected by all the things he had been talking about earlier in the book: suicide rates, black and white, imprisonment, poverty, and how a lot of the things that were meant to just hurt blacks hurt poor whites too. He talked about some of that in the interview. And I want to read the last paragraph of that chapter. He says, "It is time to stop pretending that black folks hold the patent on all those problems. Continuing our habit of national deceit and race hurts most of us, of every hue, more than we realize. Come together and build a better nation, or remain divided and watch all of our children suffer needlessly. Ultimately, those are the only two choices. There is literally no way for any of our children to escape completely unscathed in a nation that overinvests in prisons and underinvests in schools. We have all been bamboozled to some extent by a political fantasy that either of those decisions, let alone the destruction they begat, only hurt people of color. It's time to admit a whole lot of white children are in America's school to prison pipeline too." This is the way he crafts this book. So even if you don't agree with the school to prison pipeline, or you don't think these are political problems, or you think one political side somehow has the right answer, the point that he says we don't fix this unless we do it together is so important, and it's refreshing to hear someone write that down. Check out the book, and hopefully you'll be able to check out part 2 of our interview with Ben Jealous, author of Never Forget, Our People Were Always Free. Thank you. Country to say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.